The day Hazel Fairchild buried her husband with $16 to her name, 2 broken fence posts, and a drought that had cracked the earth like old porcelain, she decided she would not cry again, and she kept that promise for 11 months, 3 weeks and 4 days. The year was 1873, and the town of Caldwell Creek, Kansas sat at the edge of the open plains like a man who had wandered too far from home and simply stopped walking. It was not a beautiful town. It had a general store that smelled of tobacco and saddle oil, a saloon that never fully closed, a church whose bell rope had rotted through 2 winters ago, and a livery stable run by a man named Otis who was mostly deaf and entirely kind. There was a sheriff's office with bars on the windows, and a telegraph office that had not received a working machine until the previous spring. The street between all of these buildings was dirt that turned to soup in the rain and to powder in the heat. And in 1873, there had been considerably more heat than rain. Hazel had come to Caldwell Creek as a bride 3 years prior, following her husband Thomas Fairchild from Ohio with 2 trunks and the optimism of a woman who had read too many letters about the West and not enough honest accounts of it. Thomas had been a decent man, not a spectacular one, but decent enough that she had loved him in the practical way that married people settle into, the love of routine, of familiar breathing in the night, of knowing someone was there. He had died of a fever in February, gone in 4 days, which struck everyone as particularly cruel given that February was not even the harshest month in Kansas. She had not sold the farm. Everyone told her to sell it. Her neighbor Dorothea Crane had leaned across the fence on a cool March morning and said with great certainty, "Hazel, you cannot run that place alone. You are 26 years old and you have no children and no brothers within 500 miles. Sell it." The banker, a round-faced man named Grover Selleck, had said nearly the same thing with considerably less warmth and considerably more interest in acquiring the property for back taxes. Her husband's former business partner had written from Columbus to offer her a modest sum for the land and the suggestion that she come home. She had written back to Columbus on good paper. She had said, politely and with complete finality, no. Stubbornness was not a new condition for Hazel Fairchild. Her mother had called it willfulness. Her father had called it her strongest quality, which was the one thing that man ever said that she had chosen to keep. She had survived the death of her parents at 18, survived the crossing of the Mississippi in a wagon that lost a wheel at the worst possible moment, survived 3 Kansas winters and 2 dry summers, and 1 catastrophic hailstorm that had taken the barn roof off entirely. She had rebuilt that roof with hired hands she could barely afford, and then had paid them off by the end of the season, because she would not carry debt like a millstone if she could help it. But 1873 was testing her in ways that felt almost personal, as though the land itself had decided to push back. The cattle she had managed to keep through Thomas's death numbered 15, which was not enough to be profitable, but enough to require daily work. The well had dropped 2 feet over the summer and showed no inclination to rise. The fence along the north pasture kept losing posts to the wind and to the particular stubbornness of the soil, which rejected fence posts the way the territory rejected people who needed things to be easy. She had mended that fence 3 times since spring, and every time she had done it herself, arms aching, hands blistered raw, pride intact. She had developed a reputation in Caldwell Creek. People respected her in the abstract way that people respect something difficult and unyielding, like a cliff face or an old oak. They also found her a little frightening. She came to town for supplies, said what she needed, paid what was owed, and returned to her land without lingering. She wore her dark hair pinned severely back. She kept her dresses practical and her expression closed. She did not attend the socials at the church hall, not because she was unfriendly, though people assumed as much, but because she could not bear to sit in a room where everyone knew exactly what she had lost and was waiting for her to break. She would not break. This was the second pillar she lived on: pride. Not vanity, Hazel had no particular interest in being admired, but the deep, structural pride of a woman who had decided that asking for help was the same as admitting that everyone who doubted her had been right. So when the summer wore into August and the cattle dropped to 13 due to a cough that swept through the herd, and when the north fence came down in a windstorm that also took 3 lengths of roofing shingle, and when she found herself standing in the kitchen at 5 in the morning looking at the arithmetic of the next 6 months with the particular clarity that comes from very little sleep and no one to talk to, she understood that she was in real trouble. She did not, however, ask for help. What she did was go to Caldwell Creek on the second Tuesday of August to pick up a sack of flour, some coffee, and a new length of rope, because a woman with problems still had to eat and still had to mend fences. She tied her horse, a steady bay mare named Clara, who was perhaps the only uncomplicated relationship in her life, to the post outside the general store and went inside. That was when she first saw Marcus Redmond. He was standing at the counter with a paper in his hand, talking to Mr. Gale, who ran the store, and he was not particularly remarkable at first glance. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark brown hair that wanted cutting and the kind of sun-brown complexion that came from years of outdoor work. He wore a worn canvas coat over a collarless shirt, trail-dusty trousers, and boots that had seen serious use. There was nothing theatrical about him, no silver spurs, no elaborate hat. He looked like a working man, which in Hazel's experience was the most honest thing a man in the West could look like. She noticed him the way she noticed weather, observed, catalogued, set aside. He stepped back from the counter when she approached, giving her room with a slight nod that acknowledged her existence without making a performance of it. She appreciated that. Many men in Caldwell Creek treated her like a problem that needed solving. "Mrs. Fairchild," said Mr. Gale, pulling her list across the counter. "Got your coffee in last week. Good timing." "I appreciate it," she said. She was aware that the man Marcus, though she did not yet know his name, was still nearby, looking at a shelf of canned goods with the deliberate attention of a man who was not actually looking at canned goods. She ignored this and gave her attention to Mr. Gale, who was assembling her order with the methodical pace of a man who had never once felt any urgency about anything. "New man in town?" she asked quietly, not turning her head. "Drifted in yesterday," Gale said just as quietly. "Says he's looking for work. Used to be a cattle hand down in Texas, worked up through the territory. Got references from a ranch down in Wichita, I hear. Sheriff looked him over. Staying. Doesn't seem to know yet." She accepted her supplies, paid exactly what was owed, and left. She thought about him once more that evening briefly, while she mended the torn hem of her work skirt by lamplight. She thought references from Wichita knows cattle. Then she thought, no. Then she put the lamp out and went asleep. She lasted 4 more days. On the 5th day, a post along the north fence came down again, this time taking the adjacent section with it. She stood in the morning heat looking at 6 feet of down fence and 13 cattle that were showing uncomfortable interest in the open space beyond it, and she calculated how long it would take her to redig the post holes alone, set new posts, run new wire, and do it before the cattle wandered, and she arrived at a number of hours that was honest and miserable. She stood there for a long moment. She thought about stubbornness. She thought about pride. And then she thought about the cattle walking through that gap and the 6 months of arithmetic that would follow if they did. She went to Caldwell Creek. Marcus Redmond was sitting outside the saloon on an upturned crate, mending a piece of tack with the patient focus of a man who had time on his hands and knew how to use it anyway. He looked up when she stopped her horse in front of him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He had steady eyes, dark gray, she noticed, the color of sky before rain, not unkind. "You were at the general store on Tuesday," she said. "I was," he said. "Mr. Gale tells me you know cattle work and you have honest references." "That's true." She looked at him steadily. "I am Hazel Fairchild. I have a farm 2 miles northeast of here." I have 13 head of cattle, a downed fence section, a half-dry well, and exactly enough money to pay one hired hand a fair wage for the remainder of the season. After that, I cannot promise continuing work, though I intend to continue the farm regardless." He set the tack down carefully in his lap. "You are telling me straight out what you can and cannot offer. I find it saves everyone time." He considered this. "I appreciate that. Can you mend fence?" she asked. "Done it most of my life." "Can you work quietly without needing a great deal of conversation?" Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "I have been told I am the quietest man in any given county." She studied him for another moment, reading the lines of him the way you read a piece of land, looking for what was solid, what might give. He appeared solid. He appeared honest in the way that came through the posture rather than the words, something in the way he sat without performance, without effort to seem anything other than what he was. "Wages are $30 a month, a room in the barn loft that is dry and clean, and 3 meals a day which are not fancy but are sufficient," she said. He nodded once. "When can you start?" "Now, if you like," he said. She had not expected that. Something about the directness of it caught her slightly off guard, and she felt a small, uncomfortable loosening in her chest, not emotion. She decided firmly, just relief. Pure practical relief. "Then follow me," she said, and turned Clara toward the northeast road. He rode a gray horse that moved with quiet efficiency, and he kept pace behind her at a respectful distance all the way out to the farm, and he did not try to fill the silence, which was the first thing she had asked of him, and which he delivered without being reminded of it. By the time they reached the farmyard, she had revised her assessment of him from probably useful to possibly exceptional, which by Hazel Fairchild's scale was high praise indeed. She showed him the barn loft, which had a real bed frame salvaged from a previous owner's abandoned farmhouse, a small table, a lantern, and a window that faced east. She showed him the fence damage. She showed him the well depth and the cattle situation. She explained the routine of the place: early morning feeding, fence patrol as needed, well maintenance, general upkeep, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had organized every aspect of her life into systems, because systems did not leave you without ground to stand on. He listened to all of it without interrupting. At the end he said, "You run a tight operation." "I have to," she said simply. "I know," he said, and the way he said it carried something, not pity, which she would have recoiled from, but understanding. The kind of understanding that comes from a person who has also had to hold things together by force of will alone. She did not examine that impression too carefully. She simply said, "The post holes need digging first. The tools are in the barn," and left him to it. He had the fence mended by mid-afternoon. She watched from the kitchen window, not because she was watching him specifically, she told herself, but because the fence was her fence and she was entitled to observe work done on her own property. He worked with the efficient, unhurried rhythm of a man who had learned that speed and haste were not the same thing. He set the posts deep and straight, tamped the earth firmly around each one, ran the wire tight enough to matter without pulling the staples loose. He did not take unnecessary breaks. He did not make noise about the effort. When he came to the kitchen door at the end of the afternoon to tell her it was done, she went out and checked the fence herself, top to bottom, shaking each post with both hands. He stood at a respectful distance and watched this with his arms loose at his sides, not defensive, not impatient. Every post held. "Good work," she said. It cost her very little to say it, and cost her more than she expected to admit it. Not because it wasn't true, but because praise, spoken aloud, felt like the beginning of depending on someone, and she had become careful about that. "Thank you," he said, and nothing more. She had the habit of eating dinner alone and had not thought to change it, but with Marcus working the farm she found herself setting 2 plates without quite deciding to. He came to the kitchen door clean-handed and waited to be invited in, which she was glad of. She had heard stories about hired men who treated a woman's kitchen like their own, and she nodded him in and they ate at the table in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Midway through the meal he said, "The well." "I know about the well," she said. "There's a spring about 40 yards northwest of the house. I walked the property line earlier, and there was damp ground in a pattern that suggests running water underneath. Could be possible to dig down to it." She set her fork down. "You found that in an afternoon. I've been reading land since I was young. It's a skill my father taught me." He paused. "Texas land mostly, but water reads similar wherever you are." She was quiet for a moment. "How young were you when you started working the land?" 12, when my father's ranch got into difficulty. Worked alongside the hands from then on." Another pause, and she noticed something careful move through his expression. "The ranch was lost eventually. Drought debt, it happens." "It does," she said. "I know it does." They looked at each other across the table for a moment, and something passed between them, not the easy intimacy of people who knew each other well, but the particular recognition of people who had learned their strength from necessity rather than choice. People who understood loss as a practical reality and not a poetic one. She looked away first. "We can look at the spring possibility tomorrow," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "My name is Hazel," she said, before she had entirely decided to. A beat of silence. "Marcus," he said. It was not a dramatic moment. She cleared the plates. He thanked her for the meal and went back to the barn loft, and she sat by the kitchen window for a while in the dark, watching the lamplight glow from the small barn window above, and thinking about absolutely nothing in particular and managing it very poorly. Over the following 2 weeks, Marcus Redmond proved himself in ways that she had not anticipated because they were not the ways she had expected to need. She had expected competence, which he delivered thoroughly. The fence held. He kept the cattle organized and healthy. He managed the daily work with an initiative that meant she did not need to direct him at every turn. But he also did things she had not asked for. He repaired the broken hinge on the barn door that had been catching and sticking since April, fixed the gap in the chicken coop fencing so she stopped losing eggs to raccoons, and one morning when she came out at 5, she found that he had already started the breakfast fire in the outdoor cook space to save her the time. She stood looking at the lit fire for a full minute. She did not thank him for it. She did not know how to thank someone for the thing she had not known she needed until it was already done. The spring he had identified turned out to be real. They dug together, taking turns with the spade in the early morning before the heat peaked, and on the third day of digging they hit wet earth at 3 feet and proper water flow at 5. He built a simple wooden cover for it, and they set a hand pump salvaged from a piece of abandoned equipment he had found in the back of the barn, repaired and reseated it. And by the end of the week, she had a second water source that was flowing better than the well. She stood at the new pump, drawing water up into a bucket, and something happened to her face that she was not prepared for. It was not quite crying. She had promised herself against crying, but it was something in the neighborhood of it. A loosening, a heat behind her eyes that she refused to let go further. "Hazel," Marcus said quietly. He was standing a few feet away. "I'm fine," she said, with the automatic efficiency of a woman who had said those words so many times they had become reflex. "I know," he said, and then, carefully, "you have been running this place by yourself for almost a year. It's all right for a thing to matter." She turned to look at him. His expression was entirely straightforward, not pitying, not romantic, not performing sympathy, just honest. "I have been told," she said slowly, "that I am not very good at allowing things to matter." "Who told you that?" "My husband, my neighbor, myself mostly." He was quiet for a moment. "Seems to me that you've let everything matter. You just don't let it show because you can't afford to." She did not know what to do with that. She picked up the bucket of water and carried it toward the kitchen, and she heard him pick up the tools behind her and carry them to the barn, and neither of them said anything else about it. But she thought about it that night. She thought about it the next day while she was checking the cattle, and he was repairing a section of the barn siding. And she thought about it while she was making biscuits and watching through the window as he paused in his work to shade his eyes and look at the sky with the particular attentiveness of a man reading the weather. And she thought about how long it had been since someone had said something about her that was accurate in the way of a well-measured measurement rather than a judgment. She was 26 years old, and she had survived on stubbornness and pride alone for 11 months, and she had been very good at it. And she was also very tired, and she had not quite allowed herself to know how tired until a man with dark gray eyes and careful hands had shown her that the fence could hold without her having to be the one holding it every single moment. This was the third option he was offering, though neither of them had named it yet. The social at the church hall was held on the last Saturday of August, and Hazel did not intend to go. She had not intended to go to any of the previous 11 socials since Thomas's death, and she had attended none of them, and she saw no reason for August to be different. Marcus said nothing about it. He had no social claim on her time, and he would not have presumed to suggest how she spent it. But on Friday evening, while she was sitting at the kitchen table going over the month's accounts, she found herself looking at the numbers and then looking up through the window at the late summer sky and thinking about all the evenings she had spent alone with numbers and lamps and the sound of the wind. And she thought, suddenly and without ceremony, "I am tired of that sound." She went. She wore the blue wool dress she had not touched since Thomas's funeral. She braided her hair instead of pinning it. She brushed Clara's coat until it shone and rode to town under a sky that was turning every color of amber and copper as the sun went down over the flat Kansas horizon. She did not tell Marcus where she was going. She simply went. The church hall was full and warm and smelled of candle wax and cornbread, and Hazel stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling the strange dislocation of a person who has been alone for a long time and suddenly is not. Dorothea Crane saw her immediately and came over with an expression of barely contained delight. "Hazel Fairchild," she said. "I did not believe it when Esther said she'd seen you ride past the mill." "I believed it was time," Hazel said, somewhat dryly. She had been at the social for perhaps half an hour. She had spoken to Dorothea, to the minister's wife, to old Otis from the livery, who was mostly deaf but entirely enthusiastic about any gathering, when Marcus walked in. She had not expected him to be there. She did not know why she had not expected it. He was a free man on his own time on a Saturday evening, and the social was open to the town. But the sight of him in the doorway, cleaned up and in his better shirt with his hair combed back, produced a strange small jolt somewhere in her chest that she attributed immediately to surprise. He saw her at approximately the same moment. His expression, which was generally very composed, went through a brief moment of something she could not quite read, pleasure perhaps, though she was not sure she was reading it correctly, before settling back to his usual quiet steadiness. He crossed the room and stood beside her. "I didn't know you were coming tonight," he said. "I made a late decision," she said. "Good one," he said, so simply that she could not find anything wrong with it. They stood beside each other watching the musicians tune up, a fiddle and a mouth harp and a man with a battered guitar. And when the dancing started, they both stayed where they were, which was, she realized, a kind of companionship in itself. They were not dancing, but they were not alone, and the particular shape of that arrangement felt careful and considerate without either of them having to negotiate it. At some point, Dorothea appeared at Hazel's elbow with an expression of strategic innocence and said, "Mr. Redmond, are you not going to ask our Hazel to dance?" Hazel felt a spike of mortification. Marcus looked at Dorothea with perfect composure and said, "I think that is Mrs. Fairchild's decision to make, not mine." Dorothea blinked, reassessed him entirely, and retreated. Hazel turned to look at him. He was watching the dancers. Something about the moment felt clean and uncomplicatedly right. "I don't dance very well," she said. "Neither do I," he said. "All right," she said. "One dance." They danced once, a simple square dance pattern, bumping it slightly in the turns and laughing about it. She laughed, actually laughed, the sound of it surprising her, and when it was done she felt lighter than she had in a very long time. Not restored, not healed, but lighter. as though something she had been carrying had been set down for a moment, and she was allowed to notice what her arms felt like without the weight. On the ride back to the farm, they rode side by side, which she had not planned, which simply happened because he was riding the same direction, and there was no sensible reason to ride apart. The sky was full of stars. Kansas had remarkable stars, enormous, indifferent, and beautiful in a way that made you feel small but not lonely, if you had someone to feel small with. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said after a while. "I'm glad I did," he said. She did not ask him to say more, and he did not offer it, and they rode home through the dark with the crickets and the wind and the stars overhead, and it was the most comfortable she had felt in company in longer than she could clearly remember. September came in gold and dry, and Hazel entered the rhythm of it differently than she had entered any month since February of the previous year. Marcus had been on the farm for just over 3 weeks by then, and the daily shape of things had shifted in ways she had not predicted. The work was divided more naturally. The cattle were stable and gaining condition after he identified a wet area of the north pasture where they'd been getting into something that was making them sluggish, and moved the herd rotation accordingly. The barn had 3 repaired boards and a new door hinge, and a realigned rafter beam that had been sitting slightly wrong since the hailstorm of 1871. The kitchen table had begun to feel like a different place than it had been. They talked at meals now. Not at length, not with the ease of long friendship, but in the way of 2 people who had discovered that they had things to say to each other and were cautiously beginning to say them. He told her about Texas, about his father's ranch near San Antonio, about working cattle drives up the Kisham Trail twice before the trail got crowded with settlements. She told him about Ohio, about her father's farm there, about the particular quality of Ohio rain that she still sometimes missed because it was reliable in a way Kansas rain was not. She told him about Thomas without exactly planning to. It was a Tuesday evening, late August stretching into September, the lamp burning low between them, and she said, "He was a good man who believed in this land more than the land believed in him, I think." A pause. "I am not sure I have said that to anyone. I have thought it many times." Marcus was quiet for a moment, giving the words their proper weight. "It matters that you believe it even if you couldn't say it until now," he said. "Did you lose someone?" she asked. She did not normally ask direct personal questions, but something about the evenness of him made her feel that he would receive it the right way. He looked at the table for a moment. "My mother, years ago. My father 2 years back of a stroke. There was a woman once in Wichita. We were well suited in some ways and entirely wrong in others, and we parted honestly and without cruelty." He looked up. "I have not had any place that felt like mine in a long time." She absorbed this. "The work suits you, though." "The farming. The work suits me," he agreed. "And the company." The word settled into the room carefully. She did not respond to it directly. She looked at the lamp for a moment and then said, "I should be more grateful than I have said for the spring water and the fence and the barn repairs. I have not been good at saying it." "You say it the other ways," he said quietly. "The meals, the way you check my work not because you distrust me but because you care about the farm. The way you asked Mr. Gale about my character before you hired me, which was sensible and which I respected." A pause. "You show things through actions. I understand that language." She looked at him then, really looked, the way she had not quite allowed herself to do since that first morning at the counter of Mr. Gale's store. He had fine lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into open country. His hands on the table were calloused and capable and entirely still, which was unusual. Most men in her experience fidgeted. He was perhaps 29, 30 years old, she guessed, and he had the particular gravity of a person who had been shaped by loss and difficult work, and had come through it with his character intact. She thought about the third option. She had built her survival on stubbornness, which meant she did not quit. She had built it on pride, which meant she did not ask. These were good tools, and she was not ashamed of them. But this man, sitting across her kitchen table in the lamplight, was showing her a third possibility. That accepting presence was not the same as surrendering agency. That someone could be beside you without being above you. That there was a kind of strength that did not require being alone to prove itself. She did not say any of this. She said, "Good night, Marcus," and he said, "Good night, Hazel," and they went to their separate ends of the property. But something had shifted. She could feel it the way you feel a change in the barometric pressure before the weather actually changes, a tightening in the air, a heightened clarity to everything. October arrived with a north wind that smelled of winter, and Hazel put in the cold storage preparations, and the winterizing of the property with Marcus working alongside her throughout. And the work was more than twice as fast with two people, and she was more than twice as aware of him as she had been in August. She was aware of the sound of his voice when he called to the cattle. She was aware of the way he moved around the property with the proprietorial ease of someone who had begun to feel some claim on a place without ever asserting that claim aloud. She was aware that she looked for him first when she stepped out of the house in the morning, and that the mornings when he was already up and doing something useful were different in quality from the mornings before he had come. She was also aware, with the particular self-knowledge of a woman who had spent 11 months thinking about almost nothing but practicality, that she was in danger of caring about him beyond the category of usefulness, and she was not at all sure what to do with that. The question resolved itself, as many questions in her life had resolved, not through careful deliberation, but through an event that forced her hand. The second week of October brought Grover Selleck to her door. He arrived on a Thursday morning, a Thursday that happened to be cold and clear and beautiful, which Hazel had planned to spend checking the cattle and beginning the winterizing of the chicken coop, and his arrival ruined all of it. He came in his good coat with a paper in his hand and the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed what he means to say and believes himself to have the better position. "Mrs. Fairchild," he said, standing on her porch. "Mr. Selleck," she said. She remained in the doorway. He had, he explained, taken on the back taxes owed on the Fairchild property as a note against the estate, which was something that Hazel was aware of and which she had been paying down month by month. What she was not aware of, and what he now informed her of with the smooth regret of a man who is not actually regretful, was that there was a secondary note her husband had taken out against the property in the last year of his life. A loan from Selleck's private accounts rather than the bank, smaller than the primary mortgage but carrying a different interest rate and different terms, which had apparently been accruing since Thomas's death and which he was now presenting for payment. The amount was $93. Hazel stood very still. "I was not aware of this note," she said. "It was your husband's business to inform you," Selleck said. "My husband died before he could conduct much business." "That is unfortunately true." He extended the paper. "The terms give 60 days for payment before the note can be moved against the property itself." She took the paper. She read it. She read it a second time, looking for the thing that would make it not what it appeared to be. She could not find it. It looked legitimate. It might have been legitimate. It might have also been the calculated extraction of a man who had been waiting for the right moment and had now found it. She looked up. "I will need to examine this with proper consideration." "Of course," he said, with the serenity of a man who believed the outcome was already settled. After he left, she stood in the kitchen for a long time. $93. She had $31 in the tin box behind the loose board in the pantry, which was where she kept the farm's working funds. Marcus's wages for October would eat into that. She had cattle that would not sell well until spring. She had nothing that could be liquidated quickly for $93 without damaging the farm's ability to function through the winter. She heard Marcus come into the farmyard from the pasture. She heard him stop at the barn. She heard the particular rhythm of his steps as he walked toward the house, a rhythm she had learned the way you learn any daily sound automatically and without meaning to. He knocked on the open kitchen door. "You all right? I saw Selleck's buggy." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about stubbornness. She thought about pride. She thought about how both of those things had served her and how both of them were entirely useless against $93 in 60 days. She thought about the third option. She turned around and showed him the paper. He read it. He read it carefully, taking his time, and she watched his jaw tighten slightly and then release as he kept his expression even. "This looks like it may be real," he said carefully. "Though the secondary interest rate is high, a lawyer would know better than me." "There is no lawyer in Caldwell Creek," she said. "No," he agreed. He set the paper on the table. "There's one in Wichita. Wichita is 2 days' ride." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Hazel, do you have the funds for this?" She met his eyes. The honest answer was no. The proud answer was a deflection. She chose the honest answer because it turned out that between the two options she preferred honesty to the version of pride that protected no one and helped nothing. "No," she said. He nodded. His eyes did not change. They stayed exactly as steady and exactly as direct as they always were, which was the thing about him she found most disorienting, because steadiness in the face of bad news was not something she was accustomed to encountering. "I have been saving wages," he said. "I have $30 put aside." "That's not enough, but it's a start." She stared at him. "I cannot take your wages. I'm not giving them, I'm lending them." "That is, Marcus, I cannot." "You can," he said, and his voice was very calm. "You already took the harder thing when you hired someone. This is the same principle." She turned away. She walked to the window. The kitchen was full of morning light and the smell of the coffee she had made before Selleck arrived, and she stood looking out at her land, her fence, the new pump by the spring, the barn with its repaired boards, the 1,500-acre fact of everything she had refused to walk away from for 11 months. "I told everyone no," she said quietly, "when they told me to sell, every one of them." "I know," he said behind her. "I was right to." "You were," he said, "and you are right to fight this too. But fighting it alone when you don't have to is not strength, Hazel. It's just a habit." She turned around. He was standing in the middle of her kitchen, looking at her with those gray eyes that read like sky before rain, and she felt the full weight of what he was actually offering and what she was actually feeling, and she let herself feel it, which was perhaps the bravest thing she had done since she had refused to sell the farm. "You are very stubborn on my behalf," she said. "I have my own stubbornness," he agreed. "I've just had more practice directing it toward useful ends." She almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest thing to one that wasn't a laugh. "All right," she said. "I'll accept the loan. We'll ride to Wichita and see the lawyer." "Yes," he said, a beat of silence. "You don't have to come," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I'm going." She looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment the space between them felt very particular, like the moment before a Kansas storm when the air has gathered itself and is about to become something bigger than it has been. "Because the farm matters to me," he said carefully. "And because you matter to me, and I think you know the second thing even if we haven't said it." She held his gaze. 10 seconds, 20. The coffee was cooling on the stove and the wind was coming under the kitchen door, and everything in the room was completely ordinary except for the fact that her heart was making a very undisciplined amount of noise in her chest. "I have not been easy to work for," she said. "No," he agreed. "I am not naturally warm." "You are naturally honest," he said, "which is better." "I am not looking for, I have not been thinking about." She stopped, reconsidered, started again. "I have not let myself think about things beyond the farm." "I know," he said. "I am not asking for anything. I am just telling you what is true for me so that you know it, so that nothing between us is hidden." She breathed in, she breathed out. "The ride to Wichita is 2 days," she said. "Yes. We should leave tomorrow morning." "Yes. And when we are back," she said carefully, slowly, as though she were building something with her words that she wanted to be solid, "I think we should talk about the things that are true." Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, he was not a dramatic man, but warmly. A quiet, undefended warmth that she had not seen on a person's face directed at her in a very long time, and it landed differently than she had expected. It landed gently. "Yes," he said. "I think we should." The ride to Wichita was 2 days there and 2 days back, and it was the longest period of continuous time she had spent in another person's company in over a year. They rode through country that shifted from the flat prairie around Caldwell Creek to the slightly more rolling terrain of southern Kansas, camping the first night near a creek bed where there was enough wood for a fire and enough grass for the horses. They talked more than she expected. They talked about land and cattle and weather, about her father's farm in Ohio and his childhood near San Antonio, about the particular experience of watching a piece of land you cared about be threatened by forces that had nothing to do with whether you were good at the work. She learned that he had ridden the Kisham Trail twice, that he was 31 years old, that he had taught himself to read from a Bible and a livestock almanac which he considered an eccentric combination, and that he had a brother somewhere in Colorado he had not seen in 8 years due to the kind of falling out that had less to do with specific grievances than with the general weight of a difficult life bearing down on two people in different directions. He learned that she had wanted to be a school teacher before she married, that she still read whenever she could get books, which was not often enough, that she was genuinely good with numbers, though she would not have told anyone that unless directly asked, and that she found Kansas beautiful in a way that she had never expected and still could not entirely explain. "There's nothing in the way," she said, on the second morning, watching the dawn come across the open plain. "In Ohio, everything is interrupted by trees. Here you can see the whole sky. The whole sky can also see you," he said. "Yes," she said, "I like that too, actually. It is honest." He smiled at that. A real smile, not the shadow of one that she usually got from him, but a full, clear expression that changed his face in a way that went directly to some part of her chest and did something irreversible there. She looked away before she said something she wasn't ready to say. The lawyer in Wichita was a dry-voiced man named Bartholomew Hatcher who wore spectacles and spoke with the careful economy of a person who charged by the sentence. He examined Selleck's note for 20 minutes, asked several pointed questions about Thomas Fairchild's estate paperwork, disappeared into a back room twice, and returned on the second occasion with a document that he placed on the table between them. "The note is real," he said. "Your husband did take the loan. However," he paused in the manner of a man who enjoyed the pause, "the interest rate applied since death is not legally supportable under current Kansas statute for private lending between individuals outside a chartered institution. Mr. Selleck has been calculating interest at a rate that he is not entitled to charge. The principal is legitimate. The interest accumulated at the rate he has applied is not. What you legally owe is $51, not $93. Hazel sat very still. "51. Correct." She looked at Marcus. He was looking at Hatcher with an expression of quiet satisfaction, the look of a man who had suspected as much and was glad to be confirmed. "And he would know this," she said to Hatcher. "Mr. Selleck has a banker's education," Hatcher said, without any particular judgment in his voice. "Yes, he would know this." She left the lawyer's office with the proper documentation in her hand and stepped into the Wichita Street with Marcus beside her, and she stood there for a moment in the October Kansas sunlight and allowed herself, for the first time in a very long time, to feel something that was not determination or endurance but the simpler, cleaner thing: relief. $51, she said. "Which I have 30 of," he said, "and you have 20 or so in the tin, which leaves us only a small bit short. Which I can manage from the autumn milk sales." She paused. "We can pay it." "Yes," he said. She looked at him, standing in the Wichita Street in the October light with his hat brim throwing a line of shade across his face and his gray eyes steady and his whole bearing that of a man who had come to help because he wanted to and not because he expected anything from it. "Marcus," she said. "Yes," he said. He had the quality of absolute attention when she said his name, which she had noticed before and which she was noticing now with considerably more of her whole self than was perhaps appropriate for a Wichita Street corner. "I would like to tell you something that is true," she said. He went very still in the good way, the way of someone who is bracing not out of fear but out of the desire to receive something carefully. "I told you that I survived on stubbornness and pride," she said. "That is true. I have. But I have been surviving, not living, and I did not know the difference until someone showed me there was one. She paused. You showed me there was one. He said nothing. He was waiting fully and patiently in the way he always waited. I am not good at this, she said. I have built very effective walls. I know, he said softly. I have been standing outside them for 2 months. And you did not push, she said. It wasn't my wall to push down. She exhaled. I think I am in love with you, she said. In the direct, decisive way she said most things she was finally sure of. The way she had said no to the land buyers and yes to the farm and every other thing that had required her to know her own mind. I think it has been developing for some time, and I have been conducting a very dedicated campaign to pretend otherwise. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but shared territory with one. And then he said, with the same directness, I have been in love with you since the morning I fixed the fence and you went out and shook every post to make sure I'd done it right, and you didn't say a word because you couldn't find anything wrong with it. She stared at him. That was your moment. You were checking my work, he said, without apology, without softening it. You were just honest about your standards. I had never met anyone quite like that. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped forward, which was the most courageous thing she had done in a year, and she put her hand against the side of his face, and he turned slightly toward it like a man who has been cold for a long time accepting warmth. And she kissed him on the street corner in Wichita, Kansas in the October of 1873, with the horses at the rail behind them and the wind coming off the plain, and the sun making everything bright and ordinary and completely sufficient. When they broke apart, he put his hands on her shoulders with the same carefulness he put into everything, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing that needed saying. Let's go home, she said finally. Yes, he said. They rode back across 2 days of Kansas in a different kind of companionship than they had ridden out in the same quietness, the same practical efficiency, but underlaid now with something that had been named and was therefore real in a different way. He rode beside her rather than behind her, which was a small shift in position that meant something she did not try to make small. That evening by the fire on the second night's camp, he said, I would like to stay. On the farm, she said. On the farm, he agreed. And in whatever capacity you'll have me. I'm not making presumptions about what that means. I just want to be clear that this is not a season for me. This is, if you'll have it, something else. She looked at the fire for a moment. Then she looked at him. I am a difficult woman, she said. I know, he said. I find it one of your best qualities. My well needs constant maintenance. I'm good at wells. My pride will get in the way of things regularly. So will my stubbornness, he said. We'll manage it. She was quiet. The fire crackled. Above them, the Kansas stars did their enormous, indifferent, beautiful thing. Stay, she said. He stayed. They were married in the spring of 1874 at the Caldwell Creek church, whose bell rope had finally been replaced over the winter, and the bell rang for the occasion with the slightly uneven enthusiasm of a bell that has been out of practice. Dorothea Crane wept with satisfaction. Old Otis from the livery attended and clapped at the wrong moments, because he could not always hear when things were happening. Mr. Gale brought a jar of honey from his wife's bees as a gift, which Hazel accepted and ate most of on the wedding night with absolutely no apology. Marcus wore his best shirt, which he had pressed himself with the flat iron, and she wore a cream dress she had made over the winter from fabric she had ordered from a catalog, cream wool with pearl buttons she had traded 2 jars of preserves to Dorothea for. She looked like a woman who was doing something she had chosen fully and deliberately, which was, as Dorothea said afterward, exactly right. The ceremony was simple and the words were real. When the minister reached the part about honoring one another and keeping faith and being present in difficulty, both she and Marcus said their responses with the directness of people who had already proven these things in practice and were simply making them official. He kissed her in front of the congregation with the same directness he brought to everything, and she kissed him back with the same honesty she brought to everything. and the bell rang again, slightly off cue, because Otis had decided to help. They returned to the farm as Hazel and Marcus Redmond, which she had negotiated with some internal debate, before deciding that she would take his name while keeping everything else exactly as it was, which seemed to her to be the correct arrangement. She kept the farm in joint deed, a matter she had raised with Marcus before the wedding with her usual directness, and he had agreed without question, and had actually seemed pleased by it, which was one of the many things she had learned about him, that his ego did not require what was not his. The summer of 1874 was better than the summer of 1873 in nearly every measurable way. The rains came at reasonable intervals. The cattle numbered 20, because Marcus had traded a day of fence repair for a neighbor 3 miles east in exchange for 2 additional heifers, a trade she had approved as both fair and practical. The north fence had not come down once. The spring pump was still flowing. She had planted a kitchen garden that was producing more than she had room to store, which led to the excellent problem of learning to put up preserves in greater quantity. She taught herself from a book she borrowed from Dorothea, who had 12 years of preserving knowledge, and shared it with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting to be asked. Hazel spent 4 August days in the kitchen with jars and a boiling pot and a linen apron, and came out of it with 42 sealed jars of tomatoes, green beans, and apple preserves, and a profound new respect for how much work women's knowledge represented. Marcus, who had been very wise about not commenting on the extent of the kitchen chaos during those 4 days, said simply, when he saw the jars lined up on the shelves, "That's a good winter right there." "It is," she agreed, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing done excellently and by one's own effort, which had not changed in quality now that she was not entirely alone in her efforts. You could still have your own accomplishments when you had someone beside you. This had been the thing she had feared losing and had not lost. She told Marcus this, one evening in September, sitting on the porch in the cooling air. She told him what she had feared, that sharing the farm and the life of it would somehow diminish her own capacity, her own claim on the things she had built. "And," he said, "and it doesn't," she said. "You don't take up space in the way I was afraid of. You add to the space. There's more room here than there was before." He looked out at the land. "It is a larger farm than one person should manage alone," he said, "but that was never the problem." "No," she said. "The problem was that I could not tell the difference between needing someone and needing this particular someone." "What changed?" he asked. She considered. "You made the distinction clear," she said, "by being exactly this particular someone and no other kind." He smiled, and she had been watching that smile for over a year now, and it still did something to her that she had stopped pretending was anything other than what it was. In the spring of 1875, Hazel discovered she was expecting a child. She had suspected it for 2 weeks before she said anything, in the way she had of checking and rechecking a thing before she would commit to believing it. When she was certain, she went out to the barn where Marcus was replacing a section of the loft floor, and she stood below and said, "Marcus." He looked down. "Yes," she told him. He came down from the loft at a speed that was not precisely safe, dropped from the last rung and crossed the barn floor to her in 4 steps. He took her face in both his hands very carefully, as though she were something he was afraid of damaging by handling wrong, and he looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before, stripped of all the composure, completely unguarded, the full width of his feeling plain and enormous and directed entirely at her. "Hazel," he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her forehead. He held her very carefully. She felt his hands trembling very slightly, which she had never felt from those steady, capable hands, and it undid something in her that had been closed for a very long time. And this time, when the heat came behind her eyes, she did not refuse it, because she had promised herself against crying when she was surviving, and she was not surviving anymore. She was living. She was allowed to cry. She cried into his shoulder in the dusty barn while he held her, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and the spring light came through the east window in long golden bars, And then she straightened up, took a breath, and said, "The loft floor still needs finishing." He laughed. He laughed in the full, genuine way that she had come to love, and then he kissed her again and went back up the ladder. Their son was born in November of 1875. He arrived in the way of most births of that era, with the help of Dorothea Crane, who had midwifing experience and the willingness to be called out on a cold night. And the process was long and difficult and absolutely miraculous in the way that processes are when what they produce is a small, furious, healthy person who announces himself to the world at considerable volume. Marcus named him James, after his own father, and Hazel agreed because she had seen the way Marcus went quiet when he spoke of the man he had watched lose his land to drought and debt, and she understood what it meant to carry someone's name forward into better circumstances. James Redmond came into the world with dark hair and gray eyes that were the precise color of his father's, which made Hazel feel something fierce and tender at once. The farm with a baby was a very different proposition from the farm without one. There were days in the early months that were genuinely brutal. James was not a baby who slept with any predictability, and Hazel, who had been used to organizing everything into reliable systems, discovered that infants operated on their own entirely unreasonable systems that bore no relationship to her preferences. She said this out loud one morning at 3 in the morning, bouncing a crying James in the cold kitchen, and Marcus, who had gotten up with her, said, "He comes by the stubbornness honestly," and she was simultaneously furious and so completely in love with both of them that she could not find words for it. Marcus took the night shifts on alternating nights, which she had not asked him to do, and which he simply did. He was good with the baby, not in the practiced way of a man who had experience with children, but in the instinctive way of someone who was fully present and unafraid of an infant's helplessness. He held James with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and James, who screamed at many things, went quiet with his father in a way that was slightly unfair but entirely wonderful to witness. By spring James was sleeping more reliably, and by the following summer he was a crawling, purposeful person with opinions about everything, and the farm had reorganized itself around 3 people rather than 2, which required adjustments but which produced a quality of daily life that Hazel found she did not have a word big enough for, something in the range of fullness, rightness, the sense of a thing completed not in the sense of being done, but in the sense of being whole. She also had not lost herself in any of it. This was the thing she had feared most and the thing that had not happened. She still went out and checked the cattle herself. She still managed the accounts, still negotiated with buyers, still made decisions about the land with the authority of someone who owned it and understood it. Marcus did these things with her and alongside her but not instead of her, and the farm had become genuinely theirs. Not his, not hers, but the compound product of 2 people who brought different things and made something neither could have made alone. She told him this once, a quiet evening with James asleep and the October wind outside and a lamp between them. "You told me once that you had not had a place that felt like yours in a long time," she said. "Yes," he said. "Does this feel like yours now?" He was quiet for a moment in the considering way, not the evasive one. "More than that," he said, "it feels like us, which is a category I had not experienced before." She reached across the table and took his hand. He turned it over and held hers, and they sat like that for a while in the lamplight, which was not a dramatic moment but which was as good as any she had ever lived. In the years that followed, the farm grew steadily rather than spectacularly, which was the right kind of growing for the Kansas plains. They added to the cattle until the herd reached 40 head, which was the number they had agreed was manageable for the land they had without overgrazing it. They rebuilt the barn properly in 1877, hiring 2 additional hands for the construction over a summer, which Hazel supervised with the same exacting attention she gave to everything that happened on her land. The new barn was larger and better ventilated and had a proper loft with real flooring, and Marcus and Hazel both put a handprint in the wet plaster above the main door when it was finished. And James, who was 2, put his entire fist in it accidentally and produced a print that was roundly agreed to be the best of the 3. Dorothea Crane came to dinner regularly and remained one of the only people Hazel was genuinely comfortable being known by, which was a smaller circle than most people maintained, but which Hazel maintained with full intention and no apology. She had not become more socially expansive, but she had become more genuinely warm to the people within her circle, which those people found considerably preferable to a wide but surface-level sociability. She and Marcus settled the secondary note with Grover Selleck in October of 1873, $51 in exact legal amount according to the Wichita lawyer's documentation, presented across Selleck's desk with the kind of quiet formality that conveyed that they knew the discrepancy, that he knew they knew it, and that the matter was now fully closed and would not be revisited. Selleck accepted the payment without remark. They left his office and never had occasion to return. The well continued to function. The spring Marcus had found that first August kept flowing through every dry season, which Hazel came to regard as something personal between herself and the land, a reciprocity, a faithfulness exchanged. She maintained the pump carefully. She treated the water as the gift it was. In 1878, Hazel was again expecting a child, and this time she told Marcus within 3 days of being certain, because she had learned that waiting to share things was a habit built for surviving alone, and she was not surviving alone. This birth was somewhat easier and produced in the early morning of a February that was cold but mercifully not brutal. A daughter who arrived with considerably less drama than James and lay in Hazel's arms looking at the world with enormous, still dark eyes that everyone agreed belonged entirely to her mother. They named her Clara, after Hazel's bay mare who had carried her faithfully since Ohio, and who was now old and comfortable and permanently retired to the south pasture, because Hazel was not the kind of woman who sold a horse that had served her honestly. It was a practical kind of sentiment, but sentiment nonetheless. Clara as a small person proved to be a great deal like her mother in certain respects, and a great deal like her father in others, which was the most interesting combination Hazel could have imagined. She was quiet and observant and deeply stubborn about particular things, but she also had Marcus's patience and Marcus's gift for reading land and animals, which appeared to be heritable, and by the age of 4, she was following her father around the property with the purposeful attention of a person conducting serious field work. James, who was 3 years older, had turned out to be the gregarious one, which no one could explain by heritage, but which everyone accepted as proof that children arrive as themselves, rather than as products of their parents' natures. He befriended everyone within range, told stories of questionable accuracy with great conviction, and had Marcus's gray eyes and Hazel's unwillingness to back down from a position, which was a combination that produced a child who was simultaneously very easy to love and occasionally exhausting. Hazel loved him with the ferocity that she had learned to stop containing. She loved all of them that way: Marcus, James, Clara, the farm, the spring, the north fence that held, the kitchen with its row of preserves, the barn with the 3 handprints in the plaster. She loved it all with the fullness of someone who had once held herself very carefully away from loving things, and had discovered that the cost of that carefulness was far higher than the cost of the loving. She said something like this to Marcus in the fall of 1879, on their 5th wedding anniversary, which she had not expected to feel the weight of, and which did, in fact, feel weighted in a way she was glad for. They were sitting on the porch in the evening after the children were in bed, and the Kansas sky was doing its enormous and indifferent and beautiful thing overhead, and she said, "I think I am happier than I have ever been." He turned to look at her, and his face in the falling dark was the face she had been reading for 5 years, every line of which she knew and none of which she was tired of. "So am I," he said. I was afraid for a long time, she said. Of this, of depending on anything. I know, he said. I still have the stubbornness, she said, and the pride. I know that too, he said with the warmth that meant it was not a complaint. But I also have this, she said. The third thing, whatever you want to call it. I call it you choosing to let me be here, he said. She looked at him. Is that all it is to you? No, he said. It is also you being the most remarkable person I have ever known, and the fact of this farm and these children and this life being better than anything I had the sense to want for myself before I stumbled into Caldwell Creek on an August morning and didn't have anywhere better to be. She reached over and took his hand, which she had been doing for 5 years and which still felt chosen rather than automatic, which was, she had come to understand, the difference between a comfortable habit and a daily act of love. You had somewhere better to be, she said. You just didn't know it yet. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, an old-fashioned gesture that he did sometimes privately, and which she had never told him she found remarkable but which she did. The stars were out over Kansas in their full and indifferent and entirely sufficient number. She sat beside him in the October evening and felt the weight of everything that had been built on this land. The fence posts and the spring water and the preserved food on the shelves and the children sleeping inside and the 5 years of daily choosing. And she thought about the woman she had been in August of 1873, standing at a counter in Mr. Gale's store, who had thought she was going for flour and coffee and rope, and who had walked out with something she could not have named but which had been. It turned out the beginning of everything that came after. She had survived on stubbornness and pride alone for 11 months. These were not small things. They were the things that had kept the farm and kept her dignity and kept her from making decisions of desperation. She would not diminish them. She would not pretend she had been wrong to rely on them. But Marcus Redmond had walked into a town that had no need of him and no specific claim on his time, and he had read the land and read her and had stayed. And the third option he had offered her was not dependency and not surrender but the much more complicated, much more particular thing. The possibility of being fully herself and fully known at the same time, which she had not believed was available to her, and which had turned out to be the truest thing she had ever taken. The years ran on after that in the good way, the way of seasons that accumulate not because they are dramatic, but because they are full. The farm passed through 2 more droughts and 1 extraordinary year of rain that produced more grass than the cattle could eat, and a kitchen garden that became a neighborhood legend. James grew into a young man who could charm a room and keep cattle in line, and who left the farm at 17 to apprentice with a rancher in Abilene, which Hazel allowed, because she understood the necessity of young people needing to find their own ground, and which broke her heart in the small, manageable way that good partings do. Clara stayed close, which was not because she was timid but because she had decided the farm was where she wanted to be, and she said so with the directness of a woman who had learned it from watching her mother, and Hazel believed her because she had learned, finally, that the people who chose to stay were worth as much as the people who had built the place to stay in. Marcus turned 40 in the fall of 1882, and Hazel made him the first elaborate cake she had ever made in her life, which was a 3-layer affair with dried apple filling and a caramel glaze that Dorothea talked about for the following 3 years. He ate 2 slices and said it was the best thing he had ever eaten, and she said that was almost certainly an exaggeration, and he said no, it wasn't. And they looked at each other across the kitchen table exactly as they had looked at each other across it in the winter of 1873, and the quality of the looking was entirely the same and entirely different and better than either. She was 35 by then, which she felt as a number that had earned its weight. She felt it in her hands on cold mornings and in the way she slept deeper than she once had, and in the knowledge that the farm was stable enough that she did not have to think about it from the moment she woke to the moment she closed her eyes. There was still work, there was always work, but it was the work of a running operation, not the constant emergency of a failing one. She sat in the kitchen one evening in November of 1882, alone because Marcus was in the barn doing a late check on a heifer that was close to calving and Clara was asleep, and she looked at the room around her. The lamp on the table, the row of preserves on the shelf, 47 jars this year. The crack in the east wall plaster that they kept meaning to fix. The hook by the door where her work coat hung next to Marcus's coat, which had been there for 9 years, side by side. She thought about a woman who had stood in a cold kitchen at 5 in the morning in the summer of 1873 looking at arithmetic and thinking, "I cannot do this alone," and refusing to say it. She thought about a man who had come to a counter in a general store and nodded without performance. She thought about a fence that had held. She thought about pride and stubbornness, which had been her tools and her armor both, and about the third thing which had turned out to be not a replacement for any of it but an addition to it, a wholeness she had not been able to imagine from inside the armor. She heard Marcus's boots on the porch steps. She heard him stop at the door, stomp the mud from his boots, open the door with the particular care of a man who knew someone might be sleeping nearby. "The heifer's fine," he said. "Should be tomorrow, maybe the day after." "Good," she said. He hung his coat on the hook beside hers. He came to the table. He sat down across from her as he had sat across from her for 9 years, and he looked at her in the lamplight with those gray eyes that she had loved before she had known she was loving them. "You are thinking," he said. "Always," she said. "About," she looked at him. "About how this is the life I chose," she said, "and how that matters to me that I chose it." "It does matter," he said, "and that you chose it too," she said. "Every day since August. You keep choosing." He reached across the table. He covered her hand with his. "Yes," he said, "I keep choosing." She turned her hand over under his, palm to palm, the way she had learned to let herself be held by the things she chose to trust, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the Kansas night was cold and clear and full of stars, and the farm was quiet, and James was somewhere in Abilene probably charming someone, and Clara was asleep, and the heifer in the barn would calve by tomorrow, and the preserves were on the shelf and the fence held. It all held. Everything she had refused to let go of, everything she had added to it, the stubbornness and the pride and the third thing that had no single word in any language she knew, but which was the substance of the life she was living. All of it held in the dark and the warmth, across a kitchen table in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, with the man who had offered her a third option, and whom she had chosen and chosen and chosen again, until choosing became the very architecture of her days. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said, and the lamp burned and the night was full and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.